What's up, guys? Today, we are wading into one of the most heated, complex, and often misunderstood debates in history. We're talking about the history of slavery within Africa before and during the Atlantic slave trade. You've probably heard the arguments. On one side, people say Europeans invented the whole system. On the other side, you hear, well, Africans were enslaving each other long before the first ships showed up. So what does the actual historical evidence say? To find out, we're going to look at the works of three heavy hitter historians: John Thornton, Paul Lovejoy, and J.D. Fage. The short answer: yes, slavery was a deep-rooted institution in Africa, but why it existed and how it worked is probably not what you think. Let's get into it. First, we have to throw out our modern Western idea of money. In Europe, if you wanted to be rich in the 1500s, you brought land. Land was private property. But historian John Thornton drops a truth bomb on us here. He argues that in Africa, slaves were the only form of private revenue producing property recognized in African law. Here's the kicker. In many African societies, land was owned by the state or the community. It wasn't yours, so you couldn't get rich just by owning dirt. Thornton explains that, quote, it was the absence of land, private property, that made slavery so pervasive an aspect in African society, end quote. J.D. Fage backed this up when he points out that in West Africa, the problem wasn't a lack of land, it was the lack of people. He writes, quote, people were a very scarce resource in relation to cultivatable land, end quote. So, if you were an ambitious person in Angola or the Gold Coast in 1600, you didn't invest in real estate, you invested in people. As Thornton puts it, slavery, quote, was the functional equivalent of landlord-tenant relationship in Europe, end quote. So we know they had slavery, but was it chattel slavery? Meaning, were people treated as property? Paul Lovejoy is pretty clear on this. He defines a slave as someone who is, quote, considered to be chattel, which is to say they can be bought and sold, end quote. And yes, this existed in Africa independently of Europe or Europeans. But here is the controversial part here. Did Africans enslave their own people? The sources says no, not how we think of it. They didn't see it as Africans enslaving Africans because the concept of African didn't exist yet. They saw it as enslaving outsiders. Lovejoy writes that slavery was fundamentally a means of denying outsiders the rights and privileges of a particular society. Thornton backs this up, noting that African rulers, quote, were not for the most part selling their own subjects, but people whom they at least regarded as aliens. So, if they weren't selling their own subjects, where did you get these slaves? War. Lots of war. Thornton tells us that, quote, military enslavement was by far the most significant method of acquiring slaves. In places like the Kingdom of the Congo or the Oyo Empire, wars weren't always fought just to grab land. They were fought to capture labor. But there were other ways too. Lovejoy points out that judicial and religious proceedings accounted for some as well. Basically, if you committed a crime like theft or adultery or were accused of sorcery, you could be enslaved. Now, a lot of people argue that African slavery was softer or nicer than the brutal plantation slavery of the Americas. And in some ways, that's true. Lovejoy notes that in many societies, slaves could eventually be assimilated into the family. But don't get it twisted. It wasn't a picnic either. Thornton writes that slaves were often treated no differently from peasant cultivators. But he also reminds us that they could be executed or sacrificed at the harvest. In fact, Fage notes that in some places, slaves were preferred for important government jobs because they were totally dependent on the king. He writes that slaves, quote, sometimes seem to have been preferred for the important roles because their slave status or origin meant that their authority was solely a reflection of their master's authority, end quote. So, bottom line, slavery was there in Africa. It was indigenous. But then the Europeans showed up. Did they start the slave trade from scratch is the question. Thornton is very firm on this. He argues no. He argues that, quote, Europeans were only tapping into existing slave markets, end quote, because African law already treated people as movable property, chattel. The infrastructure to sell people was already there. Thornton says, quote, the institution of slavery was widespread in Africa and accepted in all the exporting regions, and the capture and purchase, transport, and sale of slaves was a regular feature in African society, end quote. Lovejoy introduces a concept that he calls the transformation thesis. Lovejoy argues that while slavery existed before the massive demand from Europe and the Islamic world fundamentally changed Africa, it turned slavery from a marginal thing into the main event. He writes that this demand, quote, pushed indigenous forms of slavery further away from a social framework to a system in which slaves played an increasingly important role in the economy, end quote. Basically, slavery went from being a side hustle to being the engine of the economy. Lovejoy calls this a slave mode of production, end quote. By the 1800s, in places like the Sokoto Caliphate, there were arguably, listen to this, as many slaves as there were in the United States. Now, we have to address the idea of coercion. Did Europeans force Africans to sell their people using guns and military pressure? That is the question. Thornton says Mostly, no. He argues that Europeans possess no means, either economic or military, to compel African leaders to sell slaves. The trade was voluntary. African rulers had agency. They controlled the terms. For example, the king of Benin actually shut down the sale of male slaves for a while because he needed them for his own army. Thornton notes that Benin, quote, decided to restrict the sale of male slaves, finally cutting it off by perhaps 1550. They only opened it back up when it suited them, end quote. And then Fage argues, noting that African rulers acted in their own self-interest. He writes that, quote, African communities sold slaves for export. So, what's the bottom line here? According to these historians, slavery wasn't a foreign virus injected into Africa by Europe. It was an indigenous institution rooted in a legal system that prioritized wealth in people over wealth in land, end quote. Africans enslaved others who they viewed as aliens or enemies, and they used these captives to build states, armies, and wealth. When the Atlantic trade opened up, African elites used these existing structures to engage with the world market on their own terms. But as Lovejoy reminds us, this decision had catastrophic consequences. It caused a transformation of the political economy that trapped the whole continent in a cycle of violence and exploitation that lasted for centuries. So people, history is messy, guys. It's rarely just good guys versus bad guys. It's about systems, laws, and economics. If you want to read more, check the citations below. I grabbed these quotes from J.D. Fage's A History of Africa, John Thornton's Africa and Africans in the Making of the Atlantic World, and Paul Lovejoy's Transformations in Slavery. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button.